What starts as a quiet walk through town becomes something far more dangerous when three officers decide to target a black woman thinking she's just another face they can intimidate. But they picked the wrong woman, and they clearly underestimated the dog walking beside her. Because this isn't just any woman, she's a retired military trauma counselor, and that dog. He's trained for war. What unfolds next is a chilling standoff between power, silence, and the unbreakable will of someone who's been preparing for this her entire life. And by the time the cameras start rolling, it's already too late for them to back down. Trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop a comment below, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that matter. Under the heavy hush of twilight in Pine Hollow, Georgia, a place where the air still carried the scent of magnolia and memory, Marietta Cole clipped the leash onto Valor's collar with a quiet precision that spoke of ritual more than routine. The Doberman stood tall beside her, his coat like polished obsidian, his muscles still taut with the discipline of training long past the battlefield. Her hands calloused and sure-moved with the steadiness of someone who'd spent years holding broken minds together. Soldiers, survivors, sometimes her own. The gravel beneath her porch creaked as they stepped off, each sound swallowed quickly by the long shadows stretching from pine to pine, and yet that stillness didn't comfort her the way it used to. She'd walked this loop for nearly a decade, ever since her wife Janice passed, each step away to anchor herself in the life they had built together, honest, unflinching, and quiet in its resilience. The path curved behind their old clapboard house, weaved through the edge of a wooded trail where tree frogs stirred and dusk gathered low. Valor walked slightly ahead, never pulling, never lagging, but moving in sync with her breath, her pace, her unspoken moods. Tonight, though she caught attention in him, she couldn't quite name, ears rotating back a little more often, his paws touching the earth, a beat slower than usual. The town of Pine Hollow had always presented itself as calm, clean, and uncomplicated, but those who looked too closely knew better. It smiled wide but watched even wider. Marietta had never been the kind of woman who demanded attention, but she had long since given up apologizing for her presence. Still, lately the air carried a hum she couldn't shake, a low electric buzz like a radio left on in another room. People no longer waved first. A cashier who used to ask about her dog now barely met her eyes. Her neighbor, once chatty over fence lines, had been too busy for weeks. It wasn't outright hostility, not yet. But something had changed. She turned down Willow Creek Lane, where porch lights flickered to life one by one, soft golden squares behind bug-speckled glass. A wind stirred, lifting the hem of her long cotton coat and brushing against her cheek like the ghost of a memory. Valor's body tensed for a moment, then relaxed, but his gaze remained sharp, sweeping the darkness ahead like he remembered something she hadn't seen yet. Marietta didn't speak. She rarely did on these walks. The silence between her and Valor was not empty, it was familiar, layered with meaning, a language they had learned together in the years since Janice died. "I know, boy," she murmured, her voice, low, gravelly, from years of counseling soldiers in tents, barracks, and VA centers. "You feel it too." Valor's only answer was a soft exhale, almost like agreement. They passed the community library, where the flag was already lowered for the night, the ropes clinking softly against the pole like wind chimes gone hoarse. It wasn't fear that brushed the edge of her mind. Not exactly. It was something older, deeper, what her grandmother used to call a knowing. The way the air shifts before lightning strikes. The way you notice silence not because it's peaceful, but because it's too complete. Marietta had felt it before in the eyes of a client, just seconds before he broke down in the hallway of a base hospital, moments before a mother collapsed after hearing the news. She had spent her life holding those moments steady, but now she was inside one, and she didn't like how it felt. A car turned onto the street behind her, slow, deliberate. The tires rolled over the road with that low drag of rubber on asphalt that made her instinctively glance back just once. A patrol cruiser, no siren, no headlights, just presence. She turned her eyes forward again, but she didn't need to look twice. She already knew which three were inside. Not by name, not yet, but by pattern, by posture, by the way their vehicle always showed up near the edge of her presence, never confronting, just circling like a question no one dared ask out loud. She thought of Janice, then not in sadness, but in memory, of how she used to say, "If they follow you long enough, they'll stop pretending it's a coincidence." Marietta's grip on the leash tightened slightly. Valor didn't bark, didn't growl, but his gait changed shoulders, shifting back just a hair as if bracing for wind. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel as they crossed from paved sidewalk onto the trail's entrance by the old war memorial. The names etched in stone caught the last threads of light. She paused, placing one hand gently on the worn metal plaque, not for ceremony but for grounding. Her fingers brushed over Janice's name, etched there among others who had given everything. She had fought for this country. So had Marietta. And yet the road home had never been smooth. Respect was not always a receipt handed out to those who served, especially not to women like them. She let her hand fall and continued walking, her shadow stretching long behind her now as the sun dipped below the ridge. Ahead, the woods grew darker, denser. The air cooled. Still, she didn't turn back. To change direction now would be admitting that something had shifted, and she wasn't ready to let them change her walk, her ritual, her ground. Valor stopped. One paw lifted, ears straight, body rigid. Marietta froze beside him, not with fear but with attention. Her eyes scanned the path. Nothing moved. Not yet. But she felt it like the pressure of eyes, not just watching but waiting. A twig snapped somewhere in the woods behind the trail, followed by a hush that felt too timed to be accidental. She looked down at her dog, who remained still but coiled, every line of his body drawn tight, a string ready to be plucked. She didn't need words. "Let's go," she said quietly, not to retreat but to finish the walk with purpose. Not faster, not slower, just forward. And as they moved through the tunnel of darkening trees, past the rustle of limbs and the low hum of evening insects, she felt something rise, not dread but resolve. They were being watched, maybe even followed. But she would not be moved. Her steps didn't falter. Valor walked beside her, steady, as heartbeat silent as promise. By the time they reached the far side of the trail, the last light had all but gone. A single lamppost flickered in the distance, buzzing faintly against the dark. She paused there beneath its glow, lifted her face to the chill air and exhaled. Not from exhaustion, from decision. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, she would not meet it with silence. She would walk, she would stand, and they would see exactly who they were following. It was a Tuesday evening, soft and amber around the edges, the kind of southern dusk that arrived slow and deliberate, pressing itself into the folds of the landscape like warm linen on a line. Marietta Cole had just rounded the edge of Oak Ridge Street, the leash coiled loosely in her left hand, her steps unhurried, but certain those of someone who'd earned the right to take up space but never forgot the price of doing so. The sun, low and wide over the hills, cast long shadows that danced lazily across the pavement, stretching toward her like fingers trying to brush her coat. She adjusted the collar of her navy windbreaker with her free hand, felt the familiar weight of her wife's silver pendant swing gently against her chest, and let out a quiet breath that barely stirred the air. Valor walked beside her, calm and composed, his ears tilting subtly at every passing sound, from a creaking porch swing to the whisper of distant laughter behind a screen door. His body was the picture of control, but Marietta had learned to read more than posture. She read breath stance, the subtle flick of his eyes when something shifted. And tonight, just as they passed the old Baptist church, something did. It was a pause, a hitch in his rhythm, so slight most would miss it, but she didn't. She glanced down at him, and though his pace resumed without hesitation, his tail was no longer swaying gently with his stride. It was still level, like a line drawn in warning. The sound of an engine reached them next, not loud, not fast, but steady, in a way that set the nerves humming just beneath her ribs. She turned her head slightly enough to see the cruiser pull onto the street behind her with the ease of routine, though it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. No headlights, no siren. Just presence. The same black and white patrol car that had idled too long outside the post office last week. The same one that lingered near her house when she came back from the farmer's market. She didn't need to see the faces inside to know who they were. Her mouth tightened just a bit, not in fear but in calculation. She had worked with men like them before, men who believed silence was safety, who mistook intimidation for order. She didn't stop walking. She didn't cross the street. She just kept her pace steady, and Valor by her side, letting the sound of the engine trail them like a second heartbeat, close enough to feel, far enough to deny. The sidewalk narrowed as they turned onto Beechwood Avenue, where the oak trees leaned low and the streetlights flickered unevenly in the wind. The cruiser followed slow as syrup, its tires hissing on the cracked pavement, always just behind her, never beside. She felt the weight of it, not just the vehicle, but what it carried. Assumptions, projections, suspicion, dressed up in protocol. They hadn't spoken yet, They didn't have to. Presence was a kind of language, and theirs was fluent in menace. Valor stopped again more firmly, this time his body angling slightly between her and the street. She reached down and rested her hand on his back, not to calm him, he didn't need it, but to let him know she was paying attention too. They crossed in front of the corner store, now closed for the evening, its windows covered in handwritten flyers for lost dogs, church potlucks, and community yard sales. Inside, the hum of a refrigeration unit buzzed faintly through the glass, the only sound beside the cruiser's rolling idle. Marietta paused just long enough to glance at the reflection in the window, 3 figures inside, motionless watching. The driver wore sunglasses despite the fading light. The one in the passenger seat leaned with arms crossed, and the third sat in the back, a silhouette framed by the pale interior glow. She turned her face forward again, her expression unreadable, and resumed walking. "Keep close," she murmured to Valor, who needed no reminder but welcomed the voice nonetheless. They passed a young couple on a porch across the street, 2 people sipping lemonade in the warm air, eyes flicking toward the cruiser then quickly away. No one waved. No one said anything. Just the sound of the breeze pushing through leaves and the faint squeak of a rocking chair that never stopped moving. At the next intersection, the cruiser pulled up beside them, slowing further until it nearly stopped, and a voice called out through the open window, casual but pointed. "Evening, ma'am." Marietta didn't break stride. "Officers," she replied evenly, offering no smile, no tension, just the practiced courtesy of a woman who'd long ago learned how to speak without giving anything away. "That's a big dog you've got there," said another voice, this one deeper, almost amused. "Hope he doesn't scare the neighbors." Valor didn't react, but Marietta did, if only slightly. Her shoulders straightened and her pace slowed by a half step as she turned her head just enough to meet the speaker's eyes. "He's trained," she said quietly, "and under control." The officer behind the wheel chuckled, once a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "We've had a few calls. People concerned. You understand." Concerned about what she asked, her voice still calm. A woman walking her dog. The cruiser kept pace. "Just doing our job, ma'am, making sure everyone feels safe." She stopped walking. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to force the cruiser to halt beside her, just enough to reclaim the moment. She looked directly at the officer, now her voice low but steady. "If you're trying to make me feel safe, you're doing a terrible job of it." There was a pause. A silence that stretched too long for comfort. The officer's jaw shifted, and then the window began to roll up slowly, the engine purring back to life. "You have a good evening now," he said, as the cruiser pulled away, rounding the corner with an exaggerated slowness that made it clear this wasn't the end. Marietta stood still for a moment longer, watching the taillights disappear behind a row of parked cars. Her heart wasn't racing, but it wasn't still either. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the small silver tag that hung next to Janice's dog tags, and ran her thumb across its edge. Valor nuzzled her thigh, gently grounding her back to the sidewalk beneath her feet. She let the breath she'd been holding escape in a quiet exhale, then looked up at the darkening sky above the treetops. It wasn't fear, she felt, not exactly. It was the knowing again, the sense that the rules of engagement had shifted, that the game was now being played out in quiet moves and sideways glances, and for the first time in a long while she knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an introduction. The following morning, just after the sun had crested over the rolling hills of Pine Hollow, Marietta sat on her porch with a cup of black coffee, warming both her hands and her thoughts. The mug, ceramic and slightly chipped at the rim, had belonged to Janice, painted with a faded emblem of the 22nd Military Police Battalion, now softened by time and use. Around her the town stirred slowly, yawning into the day like it had nothing to hide, though she knew better. Pine Hollow always wore politeness, like a uniform, neat on the outside, but layered with secrets stitched deep into the seam. She took a long sip, her eyes scanning the quiet street, and felt Valor stretch beside her, his lean frame unfolding with the same deliberate control she had come to trust more than most people. It wasn't the cruiser itself that unsettled her now. It was the rhythm, the predictability, the way it had started showing up like an echo of her footsteps. That car, that same black and white vehicle with its always clean tires and tinted windows, had passed by her house 3 times this week, each time just slow enough to be noticed, but never long enough to justify confrontation. And yet it spoke to her in the language she'd learned in war zones and counseling rooms, a silent pressure, a behavioral push, a presence that didn't need to announce itself to be felt. She stood up slowly, brushing imaginary lint from her sleeve, and walked down the steps with Valor at her heel, the leash already coiled instinctively in her palm like it belonged there. The air was cooler than usual for early spring, with a dampness that clung to the cuffs of her jeans and the edge of her jacket. Pine Hollow looked peaceful in the morning light, with soft shadows stretching across trimmed lawns and wind chimes clinking faintly in the breeze. But underneath that postcard calm was something else, something waiting. As they turned onto Magnolia Street, a place she used to love for its golden dogwoods and sleepy porches, she caught a shift in the air. A mailman paused when he saw her, one hand gripping a bundle of envelopes, a little tighter than necessary, before nodding curtly and continuing on without a word. 2 doors down, a woman watering her begonias froze for half a second too long, before focusing intently on the ground as if Marietta's presence demanded sudden concentration on the dampness of her soil. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even rude. It was just distant, measured. Like she had become something people recognized but no longer approached. And it reminded her with quiet clarity that there were forms of rejection more powerful than outright hatred. She looked ahead and spotted the cruiser again, parked half a block up, angled just enough to keep the driver's side shaded. The officer leaned against the hood, arms crossed over his chest, sunglasses perched too confidently for the overcast sky. She recognized the stance before the face Clay Maddox, the kind of man who had once taken an oath but now wore it like an old shirt, faded, misused, and unbuttoned when convenient. Beside him stood Officer Hale, young, uncertain, holding a tablet but not looking at it, his eyes flickering up every few seconds toward her as if he wanted to be anywhere else. The third figure, Sergeant Carver, leaned against the cruiser door, her fingers drumming a slow, steady rhythm on her baton, like she was counting something. Marietta didn't break stride. Valor didn't veer. They walked the same path they always did, not out of stubbornness but because surrender was a language she refused to speak. Morning Miss Cole Maddox called, his voice casual but threaded with something brittle underneath. "You're out early today." She nodded once but didn't stop. "Routine keeps the bones moving," she replied evenly, her voice smooth as lake water but edged in iron. "That dog's still under control." Carver added, her tone too light to be sincere. Marietta's gaze slid to her, slow and deliberate. "Always," she said, "more than I can say for some folks." Hale shifted his weight uncomfortably, but neither of the others flinched. They weren't here for conversation. They were here to be seen. To remind. To disrupt. Not with words, but with posture, with presence, with the kind of attention that made you question whether the sidewalk still belonged to you. She kept walking. As they passed, Valor glanced once toward Maddox, then returned his gaze to the sidewalk ahead, unbothered but not unaware. Marietta felt the heat of their eyes cling to her back like steam even after they were behind her. And yet she didn't look back. Not once. She turned the corner at the end of the block and paused beneath the tall hedge that separated the neighborhood from the small park beyond. The sound of birdsong filtered through the branches, and for a moment it almost felt normal again, almost. She crouched beside Valor, ran her fingers gently along the curve of his spine and whispered, "I see them now." It wasn't just the officers, it was everyone. The way the town had tilted like a glass too full, waiting for the first drop to spill. It was the way no one said her name anymore when she entered the bakery, the way the librarian didn't smile when she dropped off her books, the way the man at the diner placed her order on the edge of the counter instead of handing it to her directly. These weren't accidents, they were choices, collective quiet choices. And while part of her wanted to rage against it, to raise her voice and name it plain, another part knew that dignity sometimes looked like restraint, like walking the same path with the same posture, even when they tried to make it feel like trespassing. She stood up again, brushed her hands off on her jeans and walked into the park, not because it was safe, but because it was hers. Valor followed, unblinking ears, alert but not tense. Around them the trees swayed gently and a squirrel darted across the path in a blur of rust-colored fur. She paused by the bench near the pond, watched the water ripple beneath a soft breeze, and let the weight of the moment settle. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. But she was aware. And that awareness was no longer something that whispered, it pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, constant, steady, uninvited. She looked out across the pond where a pair of ducks drifted aimlessly in the distance, and realized something with bone-deep certainty. They weren't just watching her now, they were studying. The small wooden box had lived on the top shelf of Marietta's bedroom closet for almost 7 years, untouched except for one day every spring, the 18th of April, the day Janice came home for good. That morning, with the blinds half open and the sun crawling slowly across the edge of her quilt, Marietta reached for the box with both hands, pulled it down carefully, and placed it on the bed like something sacred. The air inside the room was still and full thick, with the quiet sounds of a world not yet awake, birds in the oak trees outside, the ticking of the wall clock, and the gentle creak of Valor shifting his weight on the rug at the foot of the bed. She sat down beside the box and opened it slowly, her fingers moving without hesitation, like muscle memory guided more by feeling than thought. Inside were the things she couldn't let go of, not because she couldn't move on, but because to forget would be a betrayal. A pair of aviator sunglasses scratched at the corners, a folded field manual annotated with Janice's impossibly neat handwriting, a photograph from Kabul, both of them smiling beneath a sun that had turned the air to fire. And finally, wrapped in a soft strip of blue uniform cloth, the silver-plated dog whistle and the worn leather training tags that still smelled faintly of cedar oil and desert wind. Marietta held the tags in her palm and closed her eyes. "You always said he'd outlive us both," she whispered, voice low and even. "But I think you knew he'd be mine before you were ever gone." Valor lifted his head and looked up at her, not with confusion but recognition, as though he understood the moment even without words. His ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and his body shifted forward, slightly alert but calm, steady in the way Janice had taught him to be. Marietta reached down and touched his collar fingers, brushing the nameplate they'd had engraved just months before Janice fell ill. "He doesn't follow commands," Janice used to say with a knowing smile, "he follows hearts." The room felt smaller with the box open, like time had collapsed inward, folding the years, until Marietta could hear Janice's laugh echo faintly off the walls. Back then, their days had been built around a rhythm of deployment and return of packing bags and counting nights of phone calls made too late and promises whispered too early. Janice had trained Valor with a precision born from war and a gentleness born from love, walking the line between discipline and devotion like only someone who had held both life and death in her hands could manage. He had been her final project, one last mission to leave behind, something protective, something fierce, something that would not flinch in the face of injustice. And now he was all that remained: 4 legs, sharp eyes, and a loyalty that did not question. Marietta stood the tag still in her hand and walked to the kitchen. The house creaked beneath her steps, the sound familiar and comforting like old joints in conversation with time. She placed the tags on the counter and began her morning routine: coffee first, then breakfast, then the leash. Valor knew the order and rose the moment the drawer opened. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "They don't see what you are," she said softly, clipping the leash into place, "but I do." Outside, the sky was washed in a pale hue, the clouds stretching long and flat like smudges across a canvas. The sidewalk shimmered slightly from the night's leftover dew, and a pair of crows argued loudly on a power line overhead. Marietta's boots struck the pavement with quiet force, the same way she used to walk the halls of the VA center, measured, patient, but unrelenting. Her mind drifted to the looks she'd received the day before, the sideways glances, the slow, deliberate silence that wrapped itself around her like fog. It wasn't new, but it was heavier now, more coordinated, more intentional. As they passed the corner of Ash and Briar, a truck slowed slightly, its driver peering at her from behind dark sunglasses before speeding up again without a wave. A few houses down, a woman on her porch adjusted her seat to face away. None of it surprised her, but it still pressed against her chest in that quiet, persistent way grief used to. Valor didn't growl, didn't react. He simply walked closer, brushing her leg every few steps like an anchor. She reached down and let her fingers rest on his head, grounding herself in the solid presence of a creature that only ever saw her completely. The path they took led through the Veterans Memorial Park, a stretch of grass and granite tucked between 2 roads that most people only noticed on holidays. Marietta paused by the monument at the center, a tall black slab engraved with names that shimmered slightly under the morning light. She found Janice's name with ease, second column, halfway down a placement she had memorized, like scripture. She said nothing. She never did at the monument. Instead, she stood still long enough to let memory settle, then moved on with the kind of reverence that asked for no audience. Across the park, 2 boys were playing with a frisbee, their laughter rising and falling like wind through leaves. One of them noticed Valor and paused, then nudged the other and pointed. "That's the dog I was telling you about," the boy said. "The army one." The other boy nodded, his face uncertain. Looks like he could rip someone's face off. Marietta heard it but didn't react. She was used to that too, the assumptions people made when they saw muscle instead of purpose, blackness instead of humanity, silence instead of submission. She walked on past the playground, past the empty benches, until they reached the far end of the park, where the trail narrowed into a gravel path that led back toward home. The trees here were taller, older, their trunks scarred with initials and hearts carved decades ago. A squirrel darted across their path, and Valor paused, then let it pass without interest. The leash remained loose in Marietta's hand, but her grip had tightened just slightly, not in fear, but in readiness. And as they stepped beneath the arch of overhanging branches with the world behind them shrinking into whispers, and the future waiting in the hush ahead, Marietta knew one thing with absolute clarity. Janice hadn't left her defenseless. She had left her prepared. It started with a shift so subtle it could have been mistaken for coincidence, the kind of thing you almost don't notice until it happens again and then again and again until denial no longer has room to breathe. At first, Marietta thought maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she'd become too guarded, too sensitive, too expectant of something going wrong. But when the cruiser passed her for the third time in 2 blocks windows down despite the chill in the air, eyes lingering from inside like a held breath, she knew it wasn't paranoia, it was practice. The same car, same men, same slow roll that always ended just out of reach, close enough to be felt but never close enough to name. She kept walking, her feet steady on the cracked sidewalk, her gaze fixed forward, shoulders squared, not from defiance but from habit. Valor's gait matched hers perfectly, his head low, ears twitching at every sound, a trash bin closing too quickly, a screen door snapping shut, the quiet grumble of tires crawling behind them. Marietta didn't speak, didn't turn around, didn't let herself offer a single gesture they could use to rewrite the story in their favor. She had been in enough rooms where truth was measured not by facts, but by tone, by posture, by whether or not you'd smiled the right way at the right time. They followed her until she reached the park, then peeled away slowly like they'd been called elsewhere. But she knew better. This wasn't patrol. This wasn't coincidence. This was conditioning. She sat on the far bench under the shade of a pecan tree, her back straight, hands resting on her knees, Valor lying at her feet like a living shadow. She didn't relax, she just breathed deep, controlled, steady. Across the park, a group of children played near the fountain, their laughter bright and unbothered, their innocence unscarred by what it meant to be watched while walking home. She glanced around, not with suspicion but with clarity. She saw the way an elderly couple paused when they spotted her, the way the man nodded slightly, and the woman gripped her handbag just a little tighter. She saw the way the clerk at the convenience store had started counting her change twice loudly, as if proving something neither of them had questioned. She saw the way the world was gently, quietly, trying to unmake her presence in spaces she had occupied long before some of these people had even moved in. It wasn't rage that filled her, it was resolve. Not hot and explosive, but low and enduring, like coals that refused to die out. Later that evening, as she clipped the leash back onto Valor's collar and stepped outside once more for their final walk of the day, the air felt denser somehow. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting long amber cones of light that barely pushed back the creeping shadows along the fences. She kept her pace slow, deliberate, crossing the intersection near Hightower Lane, where the road curved just enough to conceal a parked car until you were right on top of it. There it was, the cruiser again. Lights off, engine idling, same men, same silence. She didn't stop, she didn't speak, but Valor did. Not with a bark, not with aggression, just a low, vibrating growl that rose from somewhere ancient and unspoken, a sound that filled the quiet like thunder fills still air. The officer in the driver's seat looked up at that, leaned slightly forward, and for a moment their eyes met his gaze, searching hers unwavering. Then she turned away, not with dismissal, but with the assurance of someone who had nothing to apologize for. "Let's go, boy," she said softly, and Valor moved with her, his body tense but controlled, his attention sharpened to a point. As they made their way down the block, she heard the car pull out from the curb slowly, the tires crunching over loose gravel with exaggerated care. They didn't flash their lights. They didn't speak again. They just followed at a distance that felt less like presence and more like a warning. Marietta's fingers tightened slightly on the leash, and she kept her chin level, her breath even. Not because she wasn't afraid she was, but fear had become a language she no longer spoke out loud. They reached the end of the street where the pavement turned to dirt, and she paused at the edge of the trail waiting. The cruiser stopped 50 feet behind her and idled, humming like a question that wouldn't stop asking itself. She turned slowly to face them, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just present. She didn't speak, she didn't gesture, she just stood there, Valor beside her, both of them unmoved by the performance. After a long pause, the cruiser rolled back slowly, reversing down the road with the same unsettling calm it had arrived with. Marietta let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, then looked up at the sky above the treetops. The stars were just beginning to emerge, scattered across the dark, like truths too quiet to be noticed during the day. She stood there for a long while, watching them, letting their stillness wash over her like cool water over scorched skin. Then she turned, stepped onto the path, and disappeared into the trees with Valor at her side, two shadows moving through a world that had mistaken their silence for absence. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the calm, beneath the breath, beneath the practiced dignity that had carried her this far, a single thought settled into place like a stone dropped in water. They've stopped pretending this is about law. Now they're trying to make it about fear. By the end of that week, the shift Marietta had sensed in whispers had begun to speak more clearly. Still not loud, not yet confrontational, but present in the places. People paused the glances they exchanged and the spaces they no longer shared with her. It wasn't a storm, not the kind that crashes into a town with sirens and broken windows. It was a slow fog rolling in under the doors, changing the texture of everything familiar. She noticed it at the market, first in the way the butcher, who used to offer her marrow bones for Valor, now stayed behind the counter, eyes never quite meeting hers, voice clipped to the essentials. "You need anything else?" he asked, without warmth, and when she replied, "No thank you," there was no polite smile to follow, no parting nod of routine neighborliness. At the coffee shop on Broad Street, where her usual drink used to be ready, before she even reached the register, she stood in line for 10 minutes, while the barista, a college kid she'd known since he was knee-high, busied himself wiping the same spot on the counter until she finally cleared her throat. He blinked like she had startled him. "Oh, medium drip, right." She nodded, said nothing, and took the cup with fingers that felt more like armor than skin. Outside, Valor waited calmly by the bench, his eyes tracking every passerby with quiet curiosity. When she sat beside him, she noticed a mother across the sidewalk take her daughter's hand and steer her slightly away. No words exchanged, no explanation, offered just a quiet redirection, like proximity itself had become risky. It wasn't personal, and that's what made it worse. It was broader than one incident, deeper than one interaction, and Marietta knew from experience that these kinds of shifts didn't start overnight. They began with a seed planted in rumor, watered by fear, and cultivated by silence. Someone had said something to someone, maybe about the dog, maybe about her tone, maybe about the fact that she never looked away when they stared. And now it had spread not like fire but like mold, slow, quiet, persistent. That Sunday she walked into church, expecting at least the cold comfort of habit, but found the air inside even heavier than the one she'd left outside. A few heads turned when she entered, not with hostility, but with that vague, practiced politeness reserved for strangers. Pastor Liddell, a man she'd once counseled through his wife's cancer, met her with a handshake that felt more like a formality than a greeting. "Good to see you, Sister Cole," he said. "Been a while." She smiled softly. "I'm here every third Sunday." He blinked, then nodded, and she saw the momentary lapse in his memory flicker behind his eyes. She took her seat near the back, as she always did, but the two pews around her remained empty for the entirety of the service. Even the family with the fidgety twin boys, who usually slid into the spot just behind her, stayed near the front, this time their usual wave absent. Valor, who was not allowed inside the sanctuary, waited in the foyer with the usher calm as ever, curled into a quiet coil of patience and discipline. After the final hymn, she stood slowly and walked out without small talk, her hands brushing against the carved ends of the pews like gathering memory through her fingertips. Outside, a voice called to her just as she reached the bottom of the steps. "Marietta." She turned and saw Ruthie Fields, an old friend from the VA support circle, walking toward her with hesitation in her steps. Ruthie didn't hug her the way she used to. She just held her purse close to her side and said quietly, "I saw the patrol car outside your house again yesterday." "Everything okay?" Marietta nodded. "It's been happening more often lately." Ruthie looked down, then up. "I didn't know whether I should say something. People are talking." "What are they saying?" Marietta asked, though she already knew. Ruthie hesitated, then said, "That you're provoking them. that maybe you're not letting it go." Marietta let out a slow breath. "There's nothing to let go. I'm walking my dog." Ruthie shifted. "They're saying that dog of yours, he's trained, military." Marietta met her eyes calm but firm. "He's trained to protect, not attack." Janice made sure of that. Ruthie nodded slowly, but the doubt still hung behind her expression like a curtain that wouldn't quite close. "You know how it is," she said. "People remember what makes them feel safe, not what's true." Marietta gave a soft, bitter smile. "Yeah," she said, "I know exactly how that is." She walked home slower than usual that day, not out of fatigue but out of heaviness, like the air had taken on weight, like every step pulled against her spine. She stopped by the war memorial out of habit, ran her fingers across Janice's name again, and stood silently, not in mourning but in meditation. Valor sat beside her, his breathing, even his eyes on the tree line beyond the street. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of her coat and ruffling his ears, and for a moment the world felt like it had paused, holding its breath between heartbeat and consequence. When she got home, there was a note slipped into the crack of her front door. No envelope. Just a single piece of paper folded once. She opened it slowly. It read, "Maybe you should find a new place to walk." No name, no punctuation. Just enough handwriting to carry intention. She stared at the words for a long time, then folded the paper neatly and placed it in the drawer beside her keys. Later that night, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The stars scattered above like tiny truths no one could quite reach. Valor lay at her feet unmoving, except for his ears which stayed attuned to every rustle, every car door, every snap of a twig too close to the yard. Marietta looked out into the darkness, eyes steady, jaw, firm spine unbending. And in that stillness, beneath the hush of pine needles swaying in the breeze and the low hum of crickets reclaiming the night, one thought settled like stone. It's not just about being followed anymore. Now they want me to disappear myself. The next morning unfolded in its usual quiet rhythm. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in soft gold streaks. The kettle began its low whistle as Valor padded silently across the floor, and outside the neighborhood stirred with the hum of sprinklers and the occasional screen door creaking open. But beneath the familiar motions of routine, Marietta felt the tension returning before she even stepped out the door, like a low drumbeat in her chest, reminding her that peace here had started to feel like performance. She clipped the leash onto Valor's collar, his body alert but relaxed, and took a steady breath before stepping into the morning air that somehow felt heavier than it had yesterday. Her boots hit the pavement with the same measured pace as always, her steps deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, but carrying the quiet weight of someone who knew exactly what could happen when you allowed fear to dictate your direction. She passed the bakery on 9th, where she and Janice used to stop for Sunday rolls. But the woman at the counter, who once waved with a flower-covered smile, now barely glanced up from her phone, and the man stacking crates near the alley didn't return her greeting. He just turned slightly, just enough to avoid eye contact, just enough to say everything without saying a word. She noticed these things the way a soldier notices changes in terrain, not with panic but with precision. And Valor, walking close to her leg, noticed too. His ears twitched at sounds she couldn't hear. His eyes scanned, not just movement but stillness, the parked car with windows too dark, the silhouette leaning against the fence too still, the open passenger door of a police cruiser just ahead, on Maple Street ajar like a trap not yet sprung. She didn't slow down. She didn't turn around. But inside, her thoughts moved like floodwater, fast, wide, prepared. As they reached the corner near the library, a familiar voice rang out, forced and bright. "Good morning, ma'am." It was Officer Hale, young, polite by protocol, and visibly uncomfortable in his own role. He stood beside the cruiser, one hand resting awkwardly on his belt, the other shielding his eyes from the rising sun as if it were the glare, not the situation, that made him squint. Marietta nodded once. "Officer," her tone was level, not cold but not inviting either. From the driver's side, Sergeant Carver stepped out slowly, adjusting her holster with exaggerated care, before closing the door with a controlled click. Carver's voice cut through the quiet like a knife pretending to be a spoon. "That's quite a dog," she said, eyes locked on Valor. Not unkindly, but with something underneath, something measuring. "He seems focused." Marietta didn't look away. "He's trained," she replied calmly. "Reads people better than most." The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was dense, like all three of them knew the real conversation wasn't in the words, but in the pause between them. Carver folded her arms. "We've been getting some calls," she continued, casually brushing a loose hair from her cheek. "Folks a little nervous," said he growled at a kid near the park. Marietta's jaw didn't clench, but her breath changed just slightly, just enough. "We've walked that park every morning for 6 years," she said evenly. "If someone's child was scared, they should have spoken to me directly." Carver smiled, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "You know how people are. They don't always feel safe saying things out loud." Marietta let that hang there for a second before responding. "That's funny," she said quietly. "Because I haven't felt safe saying much either." Hale looked away at that, pretending to adjust something on his radio, and Carver's expression flickered just for a moment before she composed it again. Valor took a step forward, not aggressively but enough to shift the moment. Carver took a slight step back and Hale raised his hand instinctively, though there was no need. Marietta placed her hand lightly on Valor's shoulder, grounding him with touch rather than command. "You don't need to protect me from silence," she whispered, barely audible, but Valor responded instantly, returning to her side without hesitation. Carver watched them with a tight smile. "No need to get defensive," she said. "We're just doing our jobs." Marietta tilted her head. "Is that what this is?" she asked, not accusingly but with the calm certainty of someone who had spent decades distinguishing presence from pressure. "Because it feels less like protection and more like performance." Carver didn't answer, and neither did Hale. The street was quiet now, the early morning lull wrapped in sunlight and stillness, and for a moment the world felt like it had paused, waiting to see who would move first. After a beat, Carver nodded curtly. "Have a good day, Miss Cole," she said, her voice thinner now. "You too," Sergeant Marietta replied, then turned and walked away, her steps just as steady as before, her spine held like armor that refused to rust. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sound of the cruiser door slamming shut echoed behind her, followed by the slow churn of tires pulling away. But she didn't acknowledge it, not because she was above it, but because she'd already accounted for it in her breath. She crossed into the park and found the bench under the dogwood tree, still dappled in morning light, the petals beginning to curl at the edges as summer crept closer. She sat slowly, letting her body settle, and Valor curled at her feet like a shadow that refused to leave. A jogger passed by without a greeting. 2 teenagers on bikes swerved slightly off the path, one of them whispering something Marietta couldn't hear but didn't need to. She stared out at the still pond, watched a dragonfly land on a leaf without disturbing the water, and thought about how stillness could be both sanctuary and signal. And as she sat there, her hands resting quietly in her lap, the air thick with invisible edges, a single truth settled into her chest, like something she'd always known but never said aloud. They weren't just circling her life, they were testing the borders of her belonging. It was just past 7 when Marietta turned off the main road and onto the narrow gravel path behind St. Luke's Mission, a place she and Janice had discovered years ago while searching for quiet places to breathe after long days that held more weight than most people ever knew. The trail curved gently behind the churchyard and disappeared into a stand of oak and cedar, where the air always smelled like pine needles and damp earth, even in the dry months. It had become her favorite stretch, not because it was scenic, though it was, but because it felt untouched by the slow corrosion seeping through the rest of Pine Hollow. Here there were no curious glances, no thin smiles, no heavy silences thick with judgment, just trees, wind, and the rhythm of Valor's paws moving beside her like a metronome of calm. She walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she wanted to feel the ground beneath her. The gravel shifted underfoot with a quiet crunch, steady and familiar, while above a pair of doves cooed from a low-hanging branch, as if to remind her the world still had softness left in it. Valor trotted just ahead, his movements fluid and alert, his ears swiveling every few seconds. Not anxious, but aware in that quiet way only dogs and survivors know. Marietta let her hand brush the edge of the leash, more a gesture of connection than control, and allowed herself the luxury of a long breath that didn't feel like it had to be measured. The sun filtered through the branches in long ribbons of gold, warming her face and shoulders, even as a cooler breeze whispered along the path from the east. For a moment she thought maybe today would pass without them. Maybe they'd grown bored. Maybe they'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble anymore. But then Valor stopped just one step short of the trail's midpoint, his body freezing like a taut wire pulled tight. Marietta felt it before she even saw it, the way the air seemed to shift heavier and stiller like the pause before thunder. She looked ahead, and saw the cruiser halfway down the trail parked slightly off-center with its headlights off and engine humming quietly like a waiting breath. Behind the wheel sat Officer Clay Maddox, his hand resting casually on the steering wheel, eyes already on her, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. In the passenger seat, Drew Watkins leaned back with his sunglasses still on, despite the canopy of trees above spinning his baton slowly between two fingers. And in the back seat, half obscured by the tint, Officer Hale leaned forward slightly, his young face pale and unsure, like a boy who'd seen something he couldn't name, but couldn't unsee either. Marietta stopped walking. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers curled around the loop of the leash, but her back was straight, and her feet were planted like roots in the ground. Valor didn't bark, he didn't lunge. But the shift in his posture was unmistakable, head down, shoulders squared, tail still and low like a fuse, just waiting for the spark. The cruiser door opened with a slow creak, and Maddox stepped out first, adjusting his belt like he was settling into a role. "Evening again. Miss Cole," he said, voice flat and casual. "Didn't expect to see you back here. Not after everything." Marietta didn't blink. "It's a public trail, Officer Maddox. I've walked it for years." Watkins stepped out next, baton still twirling, though now slower, less playful. "Yeah," he said with a smirk, "but folks talk. Say you're getting real bold with that dog lately." She met his gaze evenly. "That dog hasn't harmed anyone," Maddox chuckled. "Not yet." His tone was light, but his eyes weren't. They were fixed hard, like he was daring her to move first. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it held weight. Hale still hadn't left the car. He just sat there hunched slightly forward watching her like he didn't know whether to intervene or disappear. Watkins took a few slow steps to the side, beginning to arc around them, casual in movement, but precise in intent. Valor shifted with him, his body adjusting like a shadow, placing himself instinctively between Marietta and the space where Watkins now stood. "You should really get that chain checked," Watkins muttered. "Looks like it might snap." Marietta's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "Take another step and you'll find out just how strong it is." Maddox took one pace forward. "You, threatening an officer now." She shook her head. "I'm reminding you what happens when you forget. I'm not alone." Watkins tilted his head. "You think that dog's gonna save you." She didn't hesitate. "He doesn't need to. He just needs to hold the line until someone sees." Maddox raised an eyebrow. "Nobody out here but us." And then, almost like it had been waiting for the cue, a faint, whirring sound cut through the trees, soft at first, then louder, steadier, unmistakable. All three men looked up at once. There above the clearing, a small drone hovered, blinking red and white, its camera lens trained squarely on the four of them, like a silent witness made of circuits and air. Maddox muttered a curse under his breath. Watkins dropped his baton just slightly, and Hale finally opened the door, stepping out with an expression that read less like shock and more like regret. Marietta didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just stood there beneath the trees, the sun breaking through the branches above the drone buzzing gently overhead, and Valor at her side, muscles poised and eyes steady, waiting only for her signal. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the air, not in their stance, but in the balance between them. It was no longer just about control, it was about exposure. And for the first time, Marietta wasn't the only one being watched. She looked at each of them in turn, letting her silence stretch out like a bridge they couldn't cross. Then she spoke, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a knife. "Now let's see who's really afraid." The sound of Valor's claws tapping against the sidewalk was the only thing Marietta could hear as they made their way home. The kind of silence that didn't calm, it hummed low and uneasy, like the air itself was trying to recover from what had just unfolded. Her pulse was no longer racing, but her body still carried the remnants of adrenaline, a faint tremor beneath the surface like an echo of a storm. Behind her, the trees stood tall and unbothered, but she knew better than to believe in peace just because nature hadn't flinched. The drone had disappeared into the sky like a ghost, but its memory lingered, etched into her awareness like a scar that didn't hurt until someone touched it. She didn't speak until they reached the end of the trail and turned back onto the pavement of Hillside Avenue, where the homes sat in tidy rows, and the porches always looked cleaner than the conversations that happened behind them. "You did, good boy," she said softly, resting a hand on Valor's back as they walked. He gave no response, just moved in rhythm beside her, calm again, but not relaxed, never relaxed. Her mind replayed the moment again, slow and uninvited, like a film she hadn't agreed to watch. Maddox's hand near his belt, Watkins circling Hale, frozen in the back seat, and that drone silent, hovering, inevitable. She wondered if the kid flying it knew what he'd captured, if he understood the gravity of what he had in his hands. Maybe he was just playing with new tech, testing out a gimbal hoping to film some birds or the church steeple, never imagining he'd stumble into a confrontation carefully staged under the guise of a routine encounter. Or maybe, just maybe, he knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe he'd seen the cruiser waiting like a trap at the mouth of the trail and decided to keep the camera rolling. By the time she reached her porch, the sky had begun to fade from pale blue into a deeper indigo, with streaks of lavender stretching across the horizon like someone had taken a brush to the clouds. She unlocked the door with steady hands, removed Valor's leash, and let him inside ahead of her. He padded straight to the rug near the window, lay down with a huff of breath, and closed his eyes, not asleep, just resting, listening. Marietta stood for a moment in the doorway, keys still in her hand, before she finally stepped in and shut the door behind her with a quiet click. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't check the news. She just made tea black strong, no sugar, and carried the mug to her chair by the front window where she could still see the street, but didn't have to be seen. Outside, a car passed slowly. No cruiser, just a neighbor. Still, she watched. She'd learned not to assume anymore. The weight of visibility was something she carried now like a second skin, not a shield but a mirror, reflecting back everything people expected to see and everything they chose to ignore. When the phone buzzed on the table beside her, she picked it up without looking at the screen. The number wasn't saved, but she answered anyway. "Miss Cole," the voice on the other end said, cautious, respectful. "My name's Jordan Ellis. I think I have something you should see." There was a pause before he added, "I'm the one who was flying the drone." She didn't interrupt. She just listened. "I was out by the mission trail," he continued, "wasn't trying to spy or anything. I just saw the cruiser and it didn't feel right. So I started recording." Marietta closed her eyes for a moment, the mug warming her palm. "What do you have?" she asked. Jordan exhaled. "Everything. The approach, the way they circled you, the dog's reaction, everything. I didn't edit it. I didn't add music or filters. It's just raw." She nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than he probably realized. "Would you be willing to send it?" Jordan didn't hesitate. "Already did. Email should be in your inbox. And I posted it. Not for clout. Just because it didn't feel right to keep quiet." She ended the call and sat still for a long time, the phone resting in her lap like something fragile, like something sacred. She didn't check the video yet. She would, but not yet. For now, she let herself feel what it meant to be seen, not in surveillance, but in truth, in action, in accountability. Someone had watched, and instead of looking away, they'd chosen to bear witness. That choice, simple as it was, felt like a match struck in a dark room. Outside, a porch light flicked on across the street, then another, and then a door opened and an older man stepped out with a trash bag in one hand and a slow gait that matched her own. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but he looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in weeks his eyes didn't hold suspicion. They held recognition, maybe even respect. Marietta lifted her mug and took a sip, the tea now lukewarm but grounding all the same. Behind her, Valor shifted slightly, his body still curved into quiet readiness, his ears tilting toward the sound of night traffic a few blocks away. She reached down and brushed his back with the edge of her fingers, not needing to say anything more. And in that moment, with the windows open to the cooling breeze, and the street lamp casting soft shadows through the blinds, she knew the power of a single recorded truth. Not because it changed everything, but because it proved she hadn't imagined any of it. Because now someone else had seen too. And once seen, some truths refused to be unseen. By the time the sun broke over the rooftops the next morning, the video had already made its quiet entrance into the world. No fanfare, no voiceover, no title in all caps, just raw footage uploaded by a teenager who hadn't known what else to do but hit record. It started the way so many stories did now, not with violence but with presence. A cruiser idling near a public trail, a woman walking with her dog, a moment of tension folding in on itself, until one quiet word turned the air electric. Marietta didn't check her email until after she made coffee, the ritual grounding her more than she liked to admit. She stood at the kitchen counter, Valor curled under the table like usual, and stirred her cup with slow, steady motions, then reached for her laptop like someone picking up something fragile that could burn. The video was there, just as Jordan had said, sitting in her inbox and already gathering views online like dust in sunlight. She clicked the link, turned the volume down low, and watched herself walk through the trees like an actress in someone else's script, her posture tight. Valor alert the officers unfolding from their vehicle like they had rehearsed it. There was no soundtrack. Just the sound of wind through leaves, the crunch of gravel, and her own voice steady and unbending, cutting through the silence like a held line. She watched the moment Valor stepped forward, not attacking, just guarding his body, lowered like instinct, sculpted into discipline. She watched Maddox reach, then pause, then glance up, and there in the corner of the frame was the drone blinking quietly, like the eye of a story that could no longer be controlled. She didn't finish the video the first time. She paused it halfway, stared at her own face, frozen on the screen, and felt a strange distance open between the woman she was in that frame and the one standing barefoot in her kitchen, fingers wrapped around a warm mug that no longer felt steady in her hand. It wasn't shame. It wasn't pride either. It was the surreal weight of recognition, watching proof of something you've lived but never expected anyone else to believe, much less witness with their own eyes. By noon, the video had crossed 1,000 views. By 3, someone had reposted it to a local news page with the headline, "Dog protects woman from cops, or did he?" The comments came fast like they always did, some praising her courage, others questioning her intentions more than a few, turning Valor into a symbol or a threat depending on what story they needed to believe that day. She read the first 50 before closing the tab, and stepping outside the screen door, slamming lightly behind her as she crossed the porch, and let the wind wrap around her like a truth she could finally feel without questioning. Across the street, a car slowed the driver's eyes, meeting hers for a moment too long before turning away. 2 houses down, her neighbor Gail, who used to bring her oranges every other Sunday, exited her car without a wave and crossed the sidewalk with her grocery bags angled like a shield. Marietta didn't react. She simply leaned against the railing, one hand resting on the worn wood, as Valor settled beside her, his ears flicking toward the street, like he was listening for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. Then came the shout, bright and too loud, but genuine. "We got your back, Miss Cole." It was a boy on a bike, maybe 10, his wheels rattling as he sped past, like he just said something bigger than himself. She smiled, small and fleeting but real, not because she believed everything would change, but because someone had seen her and still chosen to speak. That mattered. The divide came next, like a hairline fracture through the middle of town. Some people refused to talk about the video. Others brought it up with hushed reverence, like it was a secret piece of evidence they weren't sure they were allowed to acknowledge. She noticed which store clerks looked her in the eye and which ones didn't. She noticed which parents pulled their kids a little closer and which ones said hello a little louder than they had before. The difference wasn't in the footage, it was in what people had expected not to see, and how uncomfortable they felt once it couldn't be unseen. On Thursday, she took Valor to the weekly Veterans Brunch, the same one Janice had helped organize for years, the same one where she'd never had to explain herself until now. The community center was quieter that morning, the air thick with unsaid things, the laughter less frequent, the conversations careful. She sat near the end of the buffet line beside Susan, a widowed Marine with soft eyes and a handshake like steel. Susan passed her a glass of orange juice without saying a word. The seat to Marietta's right stayed empty the entire meal. She didn't try to fill the space. She didn't apologize for the room's discomfort. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about being liked. It was about refusing to disappear. Later that afternoon, the phone rang again. This time it was Deputy Mariah Lake, her voice calm, measured, and heavier than before. "Miss Cole," she said, "I just came out of a meeting with the district attorney. We're opening a formal investigation. The footage, it's enough to move forward." Marietta didn't answer right away. She glanced at Valor, who had stirred from his nap and was now watching her with soft, steady eyes. "They're really going to pursue it?" she asked, more curious than hopeful. "Yes," Mariah said. "And Ada Layla Carson is taking lead. She wants to meet." There was a long pause. Then Mariah added, "I won't lie to you. This is going to get louder before it gets quieter." Marietta nodded slowly, not to the phone but to herself. She thought of Janice. She thought of the long, quiet walks they used to take on base, the rules they had to follow just to exist, the stares they learned to ignore long before anyone learned to look past them. "Let it get loud," she said finally. "It's been too quiet for too long." That night she placed the empty teacup in the sink, walked out to the porch, and sat beneath the darkening sky without a word. Valor lay beside her, his breath deep, and even his eyes half closed but never unaware. A breeze moved through the trees, gentle but insistent, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked, once sharp, certain and unmistakably sure of its place in the world. The courthouse was colder than Marietta expected, not in temperature but in tone. In the way sound disappeared too quickly beneath vaulted ceilings and polished marble, in how every footstep echoed like it didn't belong. The lobby smelled faintly of floor wax and paper, and the hum of fluorescent lighting overhead gave the space a sterile hush that made even breathing feel like interruption. She walked through the doors without hesitation, Valor at her side only in memory, not allowed past security, but present in every part of her bearing. Her boots clicked against the tile with measured grace, her posture upright, not from pride, but from resolve, honed over years of needing to appear unshaken when everything around her tried to reduce her to less. Layla Carson met her outside the courtroom with a folder tucked under one arm and a calm that felt practiced but not false. The assistant district attorney was tall, composed, her black blazer sharp at the shoulders, and unwrinkled, her eyes steady and focused, not just on Marietta, but on the moment that was about to unfold. "They'll try to reframe everything," Layla said softly as they stood together by the door. "Not just the officer's actions, but yours, your tone, your steps, even the leash in your hand." Marietta nodded once. "I've been framed before," she replied, "just never in front of a jury." The courtroom itself felt like a stage dressed in solemnity, wooden pews worn smooth by years of quiet watching, a judge's bench raised just high enough to make you look up, and walls lined with plaques honoring a justice system that had not always honored her. As she sat near the front, waiting for her name to be called, she could feel the weight of a dozen eyes behind her, some curious, some hostile, some simply unsure what they were supposed to think. There was no murmur of support, no whisper of protest, just a stillness that hovered like mist, too quiet to name but impossible to ignore. When the bailiff called her name, she rose and walked to the stand with the kind of stillness that drew attention, not because it demanded it, but because it allowed for no other option. She was sworn in, seated, and faced the jury with eyes that did not flinch. Layla began gently guiding her through the events of that day, like a path already well trodden in Marietta's memory, each step clear, each word chosen for precision, not drama. "You recognize the officers, yes. Had you encountered them before several times? And on this particular evening, what did you feel when they approached Marietta, paused not for effect, but to find the truth that deserved to be spoken clearly?" "I felt like I had come to the edge of something," she said slowly. "Not fear exactly, but something close. The kind that lets you know if you give in now, you'll keep giving in." Her voice didn't shake. Her gaze didn't drop. The courtroom leaned in, not physically, but in the stillness that follows when no one wants to miss a word. She spoke of Valor, of his training, not in violence, but in discernment, in reading the unspoken, in reacting only when necessary. "He didn't move because I told him to," she said. "He moved because they crossed a line, and he knew I couldn't afford to step back." Layla nodded, her next questions measured and exact. They spoke about Janice, about how Valor had been more than a companion, how he had been her wife's final act of protection, a legacy on four legs with eyes that didn't blink at intimidation. The video was played next, projected onto a screen that washed the room in bluish-gray light. It was silent, unedited, and absolute. There was no commentary, just footage, Marietta walking, officers stepping out, their posture, the circling the moment Valor shifted forward, the drone capturing it all like a witness who didn't need to be believed to be right. The silence that followed was heavier than anything she had carried with her into that room. Then came the defense. The attorney paced like he was drawing a line around her with each step, his voice cool, his questions laced with implication. "Would you say you were already tense before the officers approached?" "I would say I was prepared," she replied, "for what he asked." "For history," she said. He asked about the dog, could he be considered a weapon, and she replied, "Only to those who came armed with assumption." He questioned her decision to keep walking after they arrived. "Were you trying to escalate the encounter?" "I was trying not to disappear," she said. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The tension didn't rise. It settled slowly across the faces of the jury, across the gallery, into the silence between each breath. By the time she stepped down from the stand, her hands steady, her stride calm, something had shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. The illusion of confusion had cracked. The framing of her as unpredictable, dangerous, or defiant had not held against the calm clarity of her presence. She returned to her seat and did not look back. Outside the courthouse, Valor was waiting with a volunteer handler near the edge of the lawn, his body upright, his tail still, his eyes trained on the door until the moment she stepped through it. When he saw her, he stood immediately and walked to her side without prompting. She crouched and pressed her forehead gently to his one hand, resting on the thick fur between his shoulders. "We did it," she whispered, not as celebration but as confirmation that a line had been drawn and held. And in that moment, under the broad sky that stretched above the courthouse dome and the flag snapping in the wind, Marietta Cole felt something she had not felt in weeks. Not relief, not victory, but alignment. Like something inside her had been restored to where it was always meant to stand. The night after the trial, testimony settled over Marietta's house, like a thick quilt, heavy, warm, and full of silence that wasn't restful. She didn't sleep much, not because she was restless, but because her mind kept replaying small details, fragments of courtroom stillness and sharp cross-examinations that now lived in her body like echoes. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Valor's face waiting outside the courthouse, his posture calm, his gaze focused as if he'd been holding the line in his own way, while she spoke the kind of truths that too often went unanswered. In the dim light of her living room, long after midnight, she sat on the edge of her couch, her hands clasped loosely between her knees, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock Janice once insisted was too loud. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the windows, and the creak of the porch boards made her glance up instinctively alert, even though she knew it was probably just the change in temperature settling into the wood. Valor, stretched out by the front door, lifted his head briefly before resting it back down on his paws. His ears still attuned to the hush that now carried a new kind of weight. There was no knock, no call, but she could feel it, that subtle shift in air, the way things changed after you stood your ground in public. It wasn't always celebration. Sometimes it was isolation dressed in polite silence. By morning she found yellow tulips on the porch. No card, no note, just a simple bouquet in a mason jar left carefully by the steps. She held them for a moment before bringing them inside, placing them on the table beside the window where the sun hit mid-morning. For a long time she just watched them, the way the petals opened slightly as the light reached them, and wondered who had left them, and whether it was meant as comfort or apology. Later that day, she walked down to the market for bread and coffee like she always did, Valor steady at her side, his presence creating a kind of invisible boundary no one dared cross. The store felt different. People moved around her like water around a stone, careful not to touch. She approached the counter, placed her items down gently, and met the eyes of Mr. Halverson, the store owner who had once asked about Janice every time she came in. Now he barely looked up as he rang up her order. "I saw the video," he said, voice low, and clipped, handing her the receipt without letting their fingers meet. She nodded, waiting. "You shouldn't have talked back to them," he added. "It could have gone worse." Marietta didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. "So I should have let them corner me?" she asked, calm as stone. He shrugged, not out of indifference but out of a discomfort he hadn't figured out how to name. "They didn't touch you," he muttered, like that alone was enough. "Sometimes things look worse than they are." She tilted her head slightly. "And sometimes," she said, "they look exactly like what they are. People just don't want to call it by name." She didn't wait for a reply. She took her bag, thanked him quietly, and walked out, the bell above the door chiming once as she left. On her way home, a woman in a blue coat passed her on the sidewalk, glanced over, then gently reached out and touched Marietta's arm as she passed. "I showed the video to my daughter," she whispered. "She thinks you're a hero." Marietta gave a small smile, not out of pride, but out of something softer, something like gratitude that didn't need words. "Tell her," she said, "to never stop watching." The woman nodded and disappeared around the corner, leaving Marietta standing in the late morning light, surrounded by motion but no longer invisible. At home, she opened the window and let the breeze move through the room, carrying with it the distant sound of children playing and the faint hum of traffic 2 streets over. Valor lay beneath the table now, his body completely still, but his eyes followed her as she moved through the kitchen. The phone buzzed on the counter. She checked it quickly. Another message, this one from Layla Carson. "We're meeting with the DA again. Defense is already moving to discredit your memory. Be ready." She stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it and set it down without responding. The tulips caught her eye again. She walked over, touched the edge of one open petal, and exhaled slowly. It was never about memory. She remembered every sound, every step, every breath between their threats. What they feared wasn't her forgetting, it was her refusing to shrink. That afternoon she took Valor on a shorter walk than usual, not because she was afraid, but because she needed stillness more than motion. As they turned onto the quiet path behind the church, the trees arched overhead like an old cathedral, and the air felt damp with the promise of rain. She let Valor lead his nose close to the ground, his steps light but deliberate. Somewhere in the distance, a cardinal called once sharp and bright against the hush. They stopped by the bench near the fence line, and she sat slowly, the wood cool beneath her. She ran her hand along Valor's back, her fingers finding the familiar dip between his shoulder blades. She didn't speak. Not for a long time. Just listened to the wind, to the leaves, to the rhythm of her own breath, settling into the quiet. And when she finally did speak, her voice was more of a thought said aloud than anything else. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she said. "I just wanted to be able to walk in peace." Valor didn't move, but she felt him shift slightly closer, his warmth grounding her like the memory of Janice's hand on her back during the hardest days. And there beneath the trees that had watched her walk for years, with a storm quietly building in the distance and a name beginning to rise in conversation beyond her control, Marietta allowed herself a moment not of victory, not of clarity, but of calm. Not everything needed to be loud to be known. Some things spoke in silence, and stood their ground with nothing more than presence. The call came just after lunch on a Monday, the kind of gray-skied afternoon where time seems to move slower than usual, as if the day itself is holding its breath. Marietta had just finished washing the last dish from her simple meal, 2 eggs, half a pear, and coffee cooled to room temperature, when her phone buzzed softly on the windowsill. She dried her hands on the edge of her apron and answered without checking the number, a habit she'd developed ever since the video spread, ever since her name left her porch and started traveling farther than she ever intended. "Miss Cole." The voice on the other end was familiar but steadier now, a bit more clipped. "It's Layla Carson. We need to meet. The case is moving forward." Marietta glanced outside where Valor was stretched across the porch, eyes half-closed, ears still alert. The clouds hung low like wool above the rooftops, and the breeze moved gently through the wind chimes. Janice had once hung beneath the overhang. "What time?" she asked. Layla hesitated. "Soon. This afternoon if you can. There's been a development." Marietta didn't ask what kind. She didn't need to. She'd lived long enough to recognize the tone of a woman preparing someone else for a room that might not offer comfort. They met in a corner office on the 3rd floor of the county building, tucked away from the usual hum of courtroom movement. The blinds drawn halfway, and the overhead light a little too bright. Layla stood as Marietta entered, motioning toward a pair of leather chairs, arranged around a low table, legal pads, scattered neatly between mugs of tea that had long since gone cold. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for Marietta to sit. "I'll be straight with you. The defense is changing strategy." Marietta leaned back, her fingers folded calmly in her lap. "What does that mean?" Layla exhaled through her nose and picked up a folder without opening it. "It means they're not just defending the officers. They're building a narrative around you now, your state of mind, your intentions, even your past work history." Marietta's face didn't change, but her breath did, just a fraction shallower, not fear, just preparedness settling in her lungs like muscle memory. "They're going to paint you as provocative," Layla continued. "As someone who escalated the encounter, someone with a trained animal and an agenda." There was a long pause, and Marietta didn't fill it right away. She stared at the steamless mug in front of her, then looked up. "Of course they are," she said, her voice quiet but unswerving. "Because if I didn't shout, they can claim it wasn't urgent, and if I did, they can call me threatening." Layla nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the old, bitter truth they both already knew. "We'll counter it, but I need to prepare you for how it will sound. They're going to ask why you didn't take a different route, why you didn't call for help, why you didn't try to de-escalate." Marietta let the words hang in the air before responding, her gaze sharp but even. "Because I was tired of moving out of my own way. Because I shouldn't have to make myself smaller just so they feel bigger." Layla held her gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around the pen she hadn't yet used. "I believe you," she said. "But this will be about more than truth. It will be about performance. You'll be under a microscope. Everything from the way you sit to how fast you blink will be interpreted." Marietta nodded once. "Let them look," she said. "Just make sure they don't look away when it matters." They spoke for another hour, reviewing transcripts, timelines, possible questions. Marietta answered each one not like someone rehearsing, but like someone laying down stones in a path she already knew by heart. By the time she stood to leave, the clouds outside had begun to break a sliver of light, finding its way across the room and resting softly on the edge of her shoulder. "When's the next appearance?" she asked, reaching for her coat. "Thursday morning," Layla replied. "There'll be press, possibly protest, maybe both." Marietta slipped her arms into the sleeves and buttoned the front slowly, each motion precise. "Then, I'll be there," she said. "Not for them, for the record." Layla offered a small nod, and for a moment they stood in quiet agreement, not just about the trial, but about the cost of being visible and the dignity in refusing to vanish. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the edges of fallen leaves along the courthouse lawn as Marietta descended the front steps, her shadow long and unbroken behind her. She didn't check her phone for updates, didn't scroll through the headlines that would no doubt be waiting full of speculation dressed as reporting. Instead, she walked slowly to her car, each step careful but unburdened, the kind of stride that comes not from confidence but from conviction. That evening, she sat on the porch again, Valor's head resting on her knee as the day wound itself into twilight. The sky turned the color of worn denim streaked with faint pinks at the edges, and the neighborhood fell into that familiar hush just before dinner and after the last mail truck. Somewhere down the block, someone was grilling, and the smell of charcoal and onion drifted lazily through the air. A child laughed in the distance high and quick, and a screen door slammed shut, not in anger, just in habit. Marietta didn't speak. She didn't need to. Valor shifted closer, his eyes half-lidded, but still watching the street, and her hand moved gently along his back, not as comfort, but as presence. The tulips from earlier in the week had begun to wilt slightly in their jar on the windowsill, leaning toward the last of the evening light, like they still hoped for something. And in that moment, with the weight of strategy behind her and the shape of justice still ahead, Marietta felt something land quietly inside her. Not certainty, not even peace, but a simple truth, clear and unshakable. They could twist the story, but they could no longer control the eyes that watched it unfold. The verdict came on a Thursday morning, cool and overcast, the kind of sky that makes everything feel quieter than it really is, as if the town itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Marietta arrived early, her coat buttoned up to her collar, hands gloved, though not from cold but from habit. There was something about the courtroom that always made her feel like she needed to armor up even in the smallest ways. The marble steps felt less imposing than the first time, maybe because she'd walked them so many times now that the weight of them had shifted from intimidation to intention. Valor wasn't with her. He was waiting back home with a neighbor's son, pacing the windows, no doubt, and watching the door for the sound of her return. Inside, the courtroom filled slowly, rows of pews creaking under the weight of neighbors, journalists, and strangers who had followed her story like a thread they couldn't let go of. The officers sat to one side, Maddox with his arms folded tight across his chest, Watkins slouched like the moment had already passed him by, and Hale sitting upright, eyes down, jaw clenched like he'd already made peace with what was coming. Marietta didn't look at them long. She didn't need to. She knew that this wasn't their moment, it was the community's, the jury's, and in some small way, hers. Layla sat beside her, flipping slowly through a worn notepad, not because she needed to read anything, but because the act of doing so kept her hands busy. "No matter what happens," she said quietly, "you didn't blink. That matters." Marietta nodded once, but said nothing. Words at this point felt unnecessary, like drawing on paper that had already been carved in stone. What had needed to be said had been spoken under oath into the silence through the fire of doubt, and now it rested in 12 hands behind a closed door. When the bailiff entered, voice low but clear, all movement ceased. People turned forward, stilling their breath as the jury filed in one by one, faces carefully composed, unreadable in the way only deliberation could teach. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with a gray suit and kind eyes, stood slowly and unfolded a single sheet of paper with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of resolution. On the charge of misconduct under color of authority, he read, "We find the defendants guilty." He paused, then continued. On the charge of conspiracy to intimidate a citizen, guilty. The final count, excessive force in the presence of a minor, also guilty. No sound rose from the gallery. No gasps, no cries. Just a deep collective silence, full and round and final, like the air had changed shape to make room for what justice sometimes sounds like when it isn't shouted, just delivered. Maddox's face didn't change. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. Watkins looked down at his lap, unmoving, but Hale looked at her, just once, just long enough to register her expression and for Marietta to see something flicker in his eyes. Maybe regret, maybe recognition, maybe nothing more than the weight of being seen when you least want to be. She didn't hold the look. She turned back to the front, back to the judge's voice, which now listed sentencing schedules and post-verdict procedures, in a tone that felt too bureaucratic for what had just happened. After it was over, people moved slowly. Some approached her with soft words and cautious smiles, others with nods of respect that carried more sincerity than any sentence could offer. She accepted it all, without absorbing it, because she knew what this moment was and what it wasn't. It was a decision, not a resolution. It was a verdict, not a restoration. No one had promised her healing, only acknowledgement, and even that had come slowly. Outside, the air felt different. Brighter maybe, though the clouds still hung overhead like gauze. A few reporters stood clustered near the curb, but Layla raised a hand and nodded toward a side exit, guiding Marietta down a quiet alley that led toward the back lot. "You want to make a statement?" she asked gently. Marietta shook her head. "No," she said. "I already did. In every step I took into that courtroom." She drove home with the windows cracked the breeze, moving through the car like a breath she hadn't fully released until now. The roads were half empty, and the town looked the same as always, quiet, orderly, scrubbed clean. But she could feel the difference in how her tires hummed over the pavement, in how her fingers relaxed around the wheel without her asking them to. She didn't need fireworks, she didn't need banners. She needed this quiet affirmation in motion, a straight road, and a name that no longer lived only in someone else's story. When she pulled into her driveway, Valor was already waiting at the window tail, rising in slow, deliberate arcs, head tilted as if he could sense the change in the air. She opened the door and he was there in a heartbeat, paws against her legs, eyes bright, breath warm against her coat. "It's done," she said, pressing her hand into his fur. "We did it." She didn't cry. Not because she didn't feel it, but because some moments aren't built for tears, they're built for silence, for standing still and letting everything that held you down fall away without fanfare. She stepped inside, removed her coat, and let the quiet of her home settle around her like it had been waiting patient and unbothered. She lit the lamp by the reading chair, made tea without rushing, and sat with the warmth between her hands, Valor resting at her feet like a sentinel whose job was never done. The tulips in the mason jar had dried at the edges now, their petals curling inward, golden and brown and still strangely beautiful. She didn't throw them away. She simply turned them slightly so the light caught them from a different angle. Outside, the sky began to open, and in the distance thunder rolled soft and slow, not as warning but as a reminder even storms know when to pass. By sunrise the next morning, Marietta was already awake, seated at the small wooden table by the kitchen window, cradling a warm cup of tea in both hands, as if the heat alone might carry her through the day. The house around her was still the kind of stillness that doesn't announce peace, but rather an absence of urgency, as though the storm had passed, and now all that remained was the space it left behind. Outside, the air held the scent of damp earth and magnolia, a subtle mix of rain-soaked soil and early blossoms, the kind that reminded her of mornings long ago when Janice would hum softly while tying her boots, getting ready to go out, before the world had stirred. Valor lay at the foot of the porch, one eye open, the other closed, his body relaxed but never unready, as if even now, with the trial over and the verdict spoken, he knew there were still things worth guarding. Marietta sipped her tea and listened to the quiet murmur of birdsong from the trees, the slow creak of wood beneath the shifting breeze, and the occasional distant hum of a car engine starting down the block. Nothing urgent, nothing hostile, just the weight of a town learning to hold still after being forced to look at itself in the mirror. When she stepped outside, the gravel crunched beneath her boots in a familiar rhythm, one that hadn't changed since the beginning. The sky was pale, with morning clouds scattered like chalk smudges across a soft blue canvas, and for once the wind moved gently against her face instead of pressing hard against her shoulders. She walked slowly, not from fatigue, but from choice, each step its own declaration that this road, this space, this town had not pushed her out. Valor moved beside her, his gait smooth and silent, his head turning slightly with every passing sound, though none of it pulled his focus for long. At the end of the block, a young man with headphones jogged past, nodded once and offered a breathless, "Glad it's over," without slowing his stride. Marietta gave a polite nod in return, not because she needed the gesture but because she understood the effort. At the next corner, an elderly woman watering her begonias paused, glanced up, and for the first time in weeks smiled, not tightly, not from obligation, but something warmer, something closer to honest. Marietta returned the smile with one of her own, and in that exchange she felt a small crack in the distance that had settled like frost between her and her neighbors. By the time she reached the park, the benches were still damp with morning dew, and the grass shimmered slightly under the rising light. She walked the perimeter once slowly, then found her usual bench beneath the oak tree, and sat down, her coat falling gently around her knees. Valor settled at her feet, ears twitching once before finding stillness. She looked out over the field at the empty swings, swaying slightly, the birds darting from branch to branch, and the sidewalk that stretched out before her like a quiet question. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket. She didn't check it right away. Let it wait, she thought. Not out of defiance, but out of something gentler, something that had waited its turn long enough. When she finally pulled it out, there was a single message from Jordan, the boy who had flown the drone, the one who had captured the moment that changed everything. "People are still sharing it," the message read. "I thought you should know. Some folks are saying it gave them the courage to speak up." She stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb hovering above the screen, before typing two simple words: "Thank you." She put the phone away and turned her face toward the sun, now higher above the trees, its light warmer, cleaner, and spilling across the park like a quiet blessing. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't victory, but it was presence. And presence, she'd learned, could be the most powerful thing of all, being seen and refusing to look away, standing where you are, without apology, even when everything around you asks for your permission to belong. Back at home, she filled Valor's water bowl and let him rest in the patch of sunlight near the window, his body stretching lazily, chest rising and falling with deep, contented breaths. She returned to her table, poured herself another cup of tea, and sat back in the chair Janice had always claimed as hers, running her fingers along the edge of the wood until the grooves felt like memory. There were no headlines waiting to be read, no interviews scheduled, no more witnesses to call. Just a quiet town, an aging dog, and the soft echo of a woman who had once whispered to her across the dinner table, "Whatever happens, you keep walking." Marietta didn't need to answer. She already had. And as the light filtered across the floor, illuminating the walls, and washing gently over the faded photograph of her and Janice at the base in uniform, she let her body soften into the rhythm of stillness. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not approval, not permission, not recognition. She had walked through fire, through silence, through the long stretch of doubt, and now she stood in the after. No fanfare, no headlines, just breath, sunlight, and the steady heartbeat of her home reclaiming its quiet. Sometimes the quietest acts are the most powerful. Marietta didn't yell, didn't fight with fists, and didn't demand the world to listen. She simply stood her ground, walked with purpose, and refused to shrink. In a world where fear often whispers louder than truth, her strength came from presence, from calm, from never letting someone else's story replace her own. And maybe that's the message we need most as we get older. Not to be louder, not to be angrier, but to be unshakable. To remember that dignity isn't something we're given, it's something we decide to carry day after day. Whether you're standing up for yourself, for someone you love, or for what's right, it doesn't always require a spotlight. Sometimes it just takes the courage to keep walking. So wherever you are in your life, whatever you've lived through, remember this: your voice, your story, your presence still matters. And if the world starts to forget, let them be reminded by your calm refusal to disappear. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another voice that needs to be heard.